in relation to Ian Hamilton Finlay, we spoke earlier today about Ian Hamilton Finlay. Julia mentioned him, I mentioned him, and obviously you have outside the permanent commission he made for the Serpentine Gallery, is actually that Patrick Eyres has known Ian Hamilton Finlay better than anybody else. He's known him for more than 30 years, I think, and has been collaborating with him on many, many issues of the new Arcadian Channel, has regularly visited Little Sparta. So we are very, very grateful to Patrick for doing here an homage to Ian Hamilton Finlay, and that will then be followed by a sound piece, by actually a reading of a poem of Ian Hamilton Finlay by the artist Carys Wynne-Evans, who needs no introduction because, as you know, he's been part of many, many marathons before. The artist, filmmaker, who has done actually collaborations here for the marathon with Simon Forti, and after his groundbreaking work with film in the 80s and 90s, ever since the mid-90s, Carys his practice more and more, came into the world of art, the world of museum. We worked for the first time together in 95, 96 on a show called Live Live about British art in Paris, and Carys had many, many exhibitions in museums such as the Fine Art Museum in Boston, the Moussac in Leon, the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris, and so on. So a very, very warm welcome to Patrick Eyres. Thank you very much for coming.
No,
Hello. 13 years ago, the Finlay work in the grounds here were open, and this slide was taken on the morning of that day because I came down here early on a day like this, gorgeous sunshine, in order to take some pictures before it all happened. So I thought I'd compare the busyness of the environment of the Serpentine Gallery with Little Sparta. And I hope you can see this, but Little Sparta is in a world far removed from the hustle and bustle of a city. It's in this remote Vale of Dunsire, 25 miles to the west of Edinburgh in the Pentland Hills. And it's about here, just below the actual moorland. And in fact, you can probably just see it above the wood over there, a little cluster of trees, and then one solitary tree by itself. So I think you can understand that gardening at that altitude, 300 meters above sea level, in all that weather, is a challenge, and it's as creative as all the poems that are installed in the garden at Little Sparta. So the pictures I'm going to show you are very much a partial view, because there are over 250 artworks in the garden there, and you'll only see about 8 or 9. The fascination about going to Little Sparta is that even if you go with a car, you still have to walk. If you go by public transport, you probably have to walk 4 miles, unless you book a taxi to pick you up from the bus, or you just walk a quarter of a mile up this track. And on the way you encounter a battle monument, and the Battle of Little Sparta has already gone down in the mythology of the place. You also encounter his bucolic neighbours, and I didn't realise, walking up that path for 20-odd years, that in the part where there isn't a fence, a bull just grazed. The neighbouring farmer just let the bull there, thinking it's not going to harm anybody. Indeed, it didn't harm anybody until the farmer told Ian Hamilton Finlay 20 years later, and then everybody got into a panic. But once you arrive, after your quarter of a mile uphill walk, you enter an idyll. And it is an extraordinary idyll, and people can visit Little Sparta for all sorts of reasons. You can visit just to see how you plant a garden in order to flourish at that windswept and snow-swept altitude. So there's a whole botany there, but there's also the design of the garden, where you transform 4 acres of moorland into a myriad Arcadian labyrinth of paths and glades, all of which are the home of poem sculptures, as Ian would call them. And we can see 2 here, or indeed the building's been transformed into a poem sculpture, because this is the former cow byre converted into the Temple of Apollo. So the ideas here, in some respects, are coming from the 18th century landscape garden, and the former building is inscribed. You can see the Corinthian columns painted on it, and it's inscribed, "To Apollo, his music, his missiles, his muses." And in the pool in the foreground, dug out by hand and fed ingeniously from springs on the moorside, you can see on a pedestal a lovely modernist homage to the most simplest of objects. It's a child's paper boat that one would make in the olden days and float down the gutters after the rain in the cities. But it's in marble to make it into the most precious of art objects. And it's on a pedestal there by the pool. And in the foreground to the right, you can see the flat top of an aircraft carrier. And what's fascinating here, what used to be a real treat visiting Ian, was to go out in the morning with toast, crusts, and bacon rind, to put them on the flat top, and to see the aircraft carrier animated by the robins and the sparrows coming down to refuel, rearm, take off, and then come back into land again. And there are other aircraft carriers in the garden where he works on the little theme of the lifts that come up to bring the aeroplanes up and down from the bowels of the ship onto the deck. And he's just lowered them a bit. So in the sculpture, they form little pools. So when it rains, they become bird baths. So again, if you lay your bacon rinds adroitly on one of these carriers, you can actually get the birds having a little wash at the same time as they swoop down to feed and to take off again. There's obviously an Arcadian summit, or a little summit going on here. This is on the left, Ian Hamilton Finlay. This was taken in 1998 as well, just after the Serpentine work opened, and he's having an earnest conversation with Ralph, the man sheltering his eyes from the sun, who became a key person. Ralph was a gardener who took on more of the heavy work at Little Sparta as Ian got older and more frail. And indeed, we've come to the point now where we're actually encouraging Ralph, because he's one of these unstoppable people, to think about progressive retirement and training a successor up. He's a bit like a London cabbie. He's got the knowledge of the garden, having worked alongside Finlay since 1991, so that's 20 years, isn't it? So we've got to make sure that all this knowledge about how Finlay's garden works, rather than just a garden, is handed on to the next gardener. And the woman to the right is Pia Maria Simic, who collaborated on the works here at the Serpentine. This pool here, the lochen, the little loch, again is ingeniously fed by a burn from the hillside, and was excavated by hiring a JCB and then piling the earth up to create an embankment. But as you look at this, he uses the environment he creates to suggest cultural references, so that what looks like the fragment of a fence in the foreground has a single word inscribed into it, and that word is picturesque. And it sort of sums up all those 18th century ideas about looking at landscapes through a cultural framework. As I said, there's over 250 inscribed poem sculptures in the garden, and you really have to be alert to spot them, because they're so discreetly and so elegantly installed. And of course, composition was one of the key things that Finlay used to talk about gardening, that gardening is indeed about composition. And his artworks, his sculptures at Little Sparta, and indeed in other installations, are all to do with the positioning of the inscribed artwork in relation to the natural forms planted as an environment for them. Other works, which, as you can see, the one on the right is just a wooden tablet hanging from a birch tree. It's inscribed A.D., a very familiar monogram of the German Renaissance artists, and evokes many of those kind of paintings, such as Adam and Eve about to devour the apple beneath a tree, with the artist's signature exactly like that. So he uses a garden for botanical and for cultural references. On the left, there's a very simply inscribed stone at the edge of one of the little pools that's inscribed, See, Poussin. Here, Lorrain. Where he's invoking the great 17th century French artists who painted the Roman Campagna and whose paintings inspired the aristocrats of England on their grand tours to produce the great 18th century landscape gardens here. So we have these massive cultural references on a garden that's at such a domestic scale. Equally here we've got on this stone on the right there, the signature of Claude Lorrain, cloudy. So he just puts the artist's signature in the landscape and invites you to envision the landscape. We can see the capital of a fallen column. You know, is the entire column, the entire building buried beneath the ground upon which we stand? Other sundered columns are there. This one is inscribed Arcadia. In the distance we can see a small bench which will be inscribed. But in the middle distance we see a wheelbarrow, which looks like a practical contemporary wheelbarrow. In fact, it's a bronze sculpture. It's a bronze sculpture that has an inscription beneath it. You can just see it on the right. And the inscription reads W. Shenstone, and his dates, 1714 to 1763. And this is an homage to the poet gardener who, like Finlay, was strapped for cash, had to think about all the ideas he had to implement to make sure they really did work, and who wrote very pithily about gardening and poetry. And Finlay, 2 centuries on, found the writing of Shenstone an absolute inspiration. And in order to make this connection between both of them being strapped for cash and having to garden physically themselves rather than having an army of labourers and gardeners, he creates this homage out of the practical, hard-working wheelbarrow. Elsewhere, there are other references which are to do with the way that lovers would carve their names in the bark of trees. And again, this comes into European literature, and in one part of the garden he has a number of lovers' names on these ceramic plaques strapped to the trees, so that it invokes the Italian Renaissance, Ariosto in particular, Angelica and Medora, the lovers that crop up there, Rosalind and Orlando from Shakespeare, and Julie et Saint-Prieur from Rousseau. So by getting you to look at these tree plaques, which are normally above eyesight, he's drawing you into the tree itself, so that you look at the artwork and you embrace the natural object upon which the artwork is placed. And it draws you into seeing the tree and hearing the sound of the breeze rustling in the trees and the windsow in the garden around you. Now, the whole aspect of the poetry of the garden is about the windsow evoking the distant sea, the distant oceans. So the objects I'm showing you are highly selected. Now, you can see here we've got a bench around the base of a tree, a bench looking out of the garden towards the hills, and it has an inscription on it which invites contemplation of the pleasures of evening, the point of the day when toil is over and rest can begin. It's a line from Virgil's Eclogues, and longer fall the shadows from the mountains high. And so we can see here this little glimpse of Little Sparta, the way that Finlay worked, creating an artwork in progress, but more than that, it's a nursery of ideas that are then transferred into the wider world outside. And in the vitrine at the back, you'll see the book that you'll see on the screen at the moment, which is the proposal for the works here at the Serpentine Garden. And you'll also see, well, you won't necessarily see that clearly, because this one is in Latin here. It's the first of the 8 benches out there. But it's the same inscription. So you can see him using the garden at Little Sparta, working out ideas through objects in relation to nature in the garden, and then transferring into this exquisite sort of bookwork of a proposal. And because he's so fascinated with language and the transformations of language, it's not just, of the 8 benches out there, it's not just one with the Latin on, there are 7 others with the nuances of the translation of the same 2 lines of Virgil that span the centuries from 1680, from Carroll to the late 20th century with the contemporary poem Harry Gilonis, all translating the same 2 lines of Virgil. But what's so lovely is that he invokes in the heart of the metropolis, here at the Serpentine, the idea of evening, that point at which work concludes, that point of rest and relaxation after the day. So he takes an idea out of classical antiquity, mediates it through Little Sparta, through the bookwork, translates it out into the wider world through a proposal, and here it is at the Serpentine installed. So we're looking now at that glorious day in May 1998, not unlike this glorious October day in 2011, at what the Serpentine Garden looked like all those years ago. And you can see where the benches are. You can see the one on the left and then 4 further over in the distance. The hedge there is minute. It's only just been planted. So we're almost seeing it from a different time. But the benches, I'm delighted to see today, are still so used, people sitting on it, feeding children, feeding themselves, picnicking, exactly as they were intended to be. But I suppose, again, the idea of the benches is key to his permanent homage to the 18th century poet gardener William Shenstone. And indeed, in the proposal for the Serpentine here, he says that in Shenstone's gardens, benches had poems on. In modern gardens, they don't. So he puts poems on all the benches that he creates, that is, Finlay does. And indeed, tucked away on a hill, on a tree, which will be reintegrated once this fantastic pavilion, sadly, has to go, is an inscribed tree plaque, which does more than just draw your eye up to it to see it. The translation of it is, "Home, goats, home, replete, the evening star is coming." So generally, his tree plaques encourage you to look up into the tree to enjoy the aroma, the visual delight of that particular tree, to see and hear the wind sough. But this directs your eyes, and the question now, is it visible anymore? Is the aerial pollution of the centre of this city such that the evening star can no longer be seen? Or can it? Do we no longer know? Do we look to the heavens and say, where tonight is the evening star? I will wend my way from my weary place of work to my home, guided by the evening star. Is that possible? Who knows? Maybe we should all check it out tonight. Now, another work which is delightful of the Serpentine series is the circular paved area outside the entrance to the Serpentine, which is just extraordinary because, like so many of Finlay's works, they invite you to address the surrounding environment. So if you stand in the centre of the paved area and go round and round and round and round and round and round, say you're 4 years old or something, reading it all, you read the names in Latin and in English of all the trees surrounding the Serpentine Gallery. And as you work inwards, just going slow enough not to get dizzy, you read the lovely inscription from Francis Hutchinson, an 18th century philosopher that Finlay was fond of, where he talks about the qualities of trees. Trees are wonderful for giving us shade and rest and concealment, he says. Now, what kind of people would be wanting concealment? And he says, for the religious, so spiritual experience, for the pensive, for the melancholy, for all the thinkers. And then it says, as the very last type of person, for the amorous. And we think, aha, this is what all these groves are about. But it's well worth, especially if you've got little kids, get them to turn round in it, spot all the trees that are identified, and then go out and look at them around the Serpentine. So here we go, and in the centre of this, there we are. That's such a clean slide of it. My goodness, that was taken in 1998. You can tell all the desire lines are not on this picture. There we go. We can see for the pensive, the melancholy, and the amorous, and right in the centre. And tragically, in the midst of this commission, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in Paris, and the Serpentine asked Finlay if he could think about some way in which she could be commemorated in the work that was currently being made. And so at the heart of this work, at the entrance of the Serpentine, he actually commemorates the fact that for 3 years before she died, she was a patron of the Serpentine. So she's absorbed into the history, the presence of the Serpentine Gallery as a memorial to her passing. And so I think, gosh, I've actually finished early. I'll have to slow down now. But I just want to take you back out of the city centre, up to the Vale of Dunsire, and just to remember in our busy urban lives what a treat it is to visit somewhere like Little Sparta, because in an age in which one can access almost anything by car, from your front door to the front door of where you're going, the fact that you've got to abandon the car and walk up a tractor track for a quarter of a mile in whatever weather it is that you meet. It might be glorious sunshine, it could be hammering rain, it could be snow, but you've got to make that walk, and it's just such, it restores that sense of anticipation of what you're going to see, and what you anticipate and what you experience is wonderful. Thank you.